The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to the Y for the fourth of 5 evenings devoted to art spaces and the shape of the city. Following tonight's slide presentation, series moderator Paul Goldberger, architecture critic of the New York Times, will discuss further with our guests Hugh Hardy and Malcolm Holzman specifics about some of their projects. During their conversation on stage, you may write your questions on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. Ushers will come down the aisles, collect your cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. Our guests this evening, Hugh Hardy and Malcolm Holzman, constitute 2/3 of their firm, Hardy Holzman Pfeiffer, a firm which has been recognized with the Architectural Firm Award of the American Institute of Architects in 1981, the Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the AIA in 1978, and the 1974 Brunner Prize in Architecture from the National Institute of Arts and Letters. The firm has also received AIA Honor Awards in 1976, 78, 79, 81, and 83. Hugh Hardy received his Master of Fine Arts in Architecture from Princeton University in 1956. He serves as a consultant for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, is chairman of the Design Arts Advisory Panel of the National Endowment for the Arts, is vice president and member of the Executive Committee of the Municipal Art Society of New York, and is vice president for architecture for the Architectural League of New York. With Malcolm Holzman, he serves as the Saarinen Visiting Professor of Architectural Design at the Graduate Design Studio of Yale University. Malcolm Holzman holds a degree in architecture from the Pratt Institute. A member of the Architectural League of New York and the Municipal Art Society of New York, Mr. Holzman has also served as the Eschweiler Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Hardy Holzman and Pfeiffer are the architects for the Los Angeles County Museum, the Minneapolis Orchestra Hall, and locally were the designers of the Joyce Theater renovation here in New York, making it one of the new important viable halls, which is now a home to much of the modern dance community. We're delighted that Mr. Hardy and Mr. Holzman were able to take time out from their busy schedules to join you and Paul Goldberger here tonight. Please join me now in welcoming them. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Let me just add a word of welcome again to all of you and turn the platform over to Hugh Hardy. Don't sit down, Hugh. And Malcolm Holzman. And we'll, as usual, see a very brief presentation of some of their work and current concerns. And then the majestic screen will silently rise and we'll sit down and talk. Thank you.
We thought a quick survey would do, and some of these slides I selected and some Malcolm selected. It's always seemed to us that demolition is as intriguing as construction, that the imagery of buildings falling apart and buildings being put together is something of great appeal because you always complete the picture. It's also true that restoration is an interesting subject. On the left is a building that's been completely restored physically. On the right is a building that's been completely restored to use.
Continuity is at the heart of our work. Frequently, buildings are only discussed as individual objects. We've been fortunate enough to make many facilities for the arts, the first being Orchestra Hall in Minneapolis, the plan on the right. On the left is Denver, a concert hall in the round. The continuity in our work is not from style and detail, but in thinking about those projects.
Oh, this is my doing. This is about change. This is about Americans and change and eating and habits and hygiene and what that did to architecture.
Not enough. The fun of our work is it gets confused with lots of other things. We don't only think about architecture. But we continue to make buildings over long periods of time and the shaping of rooms so that they're all individualistic
And the extraordinary range of experience between formal and informal, because we all lead double lives.
Our buildings are really about how to bring people together. This is a project in Anchorage, Alaska, that's currently under construction, so I can't show you what it will look like yet, but it's slowly beginning to appear on the landscape.
Then there's this extraordinary thing about performing arts and the visual arts, because in the performing arts, you're theoretically being entertained, whereas in the visual arts, the experience is direct. The people in the theater are trying to achieve what the people in the visual arts have been doing for years, and vice versa.
The visual arts must make good rooms for people, just as auditoriums must do the same. And although the objects are totally different, it's how you feel when you go to these places that count the most.
Then there's the urban landscape, and there's a rural landscape. And we certainly see criticisms of urban buildings as if they were rural, and vice versa.
There are lots of images that relate to our building projects.
Oh, and there's what buildings are made out of, because they can get carved out of rocks and piled up in the air, or they can be made out of the imagery of glass and steel. That's another tangle that seems at the moment to bedevil the profession.
Continuity. There's a question about how one uses history in remaking older buildings and still providing a wonderful experience when they come to them.
And then you have the architect. You have the imagined architect on the left, on your right, and the real architect on your left, choosing the materials for the site. And then finally you see how we are all caught up in nostalgia one way or another.
I'll sit on the piano. We could bring out one of those.
You on the piano.
I'll sit on the table. That was quick. Pretty tall. Malcolm.
Thank you.
It's like being at the dentist.
What?
I really think actually there is something appropriate about the presence of that grand piano tonight. Actually, despite the. No, I will not ask you to sit on it or at it. But I do want to know who writes your material. It's really wonderful. It's super. You talked about a couple of things that were, in one sense, I think, give us almost total insight into your architecture, and in another way, none at all. In that you spoke of the range of experience between formal and informal, of nostalgia, and of how to bring people together. It seems to me that particularly an observation like architecture is bringing people together is one that could be uttered by architects whose work contains the sophistication for which yours is known. It could also be spoken of, and indeed has been, as a justification for the work of somebody like John Portman. What I'm asking is, how do we actually make the leap between the words that you've just given us and your own work, which is quite sophisticated? I guess what I'm really saying is talk a little bit about populism in your work, and is it something you consciously seek? Is it something you want to comment on in your work, or simply do?
That's your question, Hugh.
Well, populism is not actually at the moment particularly well thought of.
Right.
I mean, first of all, you have to define what populism means. I think it refers to a specific political idea that I'm not completely knowledgeable about. But in my sense of the word populism, it's an inclusive thing in which the public is it's not exactly the same as democracy. Democracy is yet another issue. But populism as a catchword means that everybody's welcome, and that we live in a society in which the public and the public issues are terribly important, and that what is the business about war is too important to be left to the generals and so forth, and that democracy is too important to be left to the leaders, that we really, as a populist bunch of people, have instincts that are worth thinking about and worth sharing and worth providing the images of leadership,
right.
So that things that include the public and its theoretically unenlightened aesthetic experience are very important. Now, the profession for a generation has been wrestling with that idea, that kitsch is okay, and I mean, John Portman is he's a subject in and of himself,
sure,
because he's consciously choosing and manipulating images. But there are all kinds of wonderful, wonderful things all around us in this city, especially if you get out of Manhattan and stay in the city. The most amazing landscape, which has all been made consciously but not by professionals. And in that sense, populism has always and continues to be, even before Marie Antoinette, an extraordinary resource of ideas and energy. And it's not unlike how language itself works, because the language becomes dead if it doesn't have constantly infused into it new images in language. And since our profession is a language, the same thing happens in architecture.
Is it fair to think of your work as a kind of whimsical mix of both high art and low art or popular imagery? Is that...
I think the word we'd prefer to use is maybe delightful.
Okay.
It's hard to imagine. I haven't seen a building I've laughed at lately, intentionally.
Right.
So the notion that
I have.
the notion that architecture is fun or a joke or something like that, I think, is off the topic. But I think that there are buildings that you enjoy going back to. They give you a sense of comfort and pleasure. And I think that sense of delight is something that you'd like to convey in buildings. I think we'd like to think that we do that.
In terms of to at least start with the subject we're supposed to be on tonight, the cultural spaces you've done, what Orchestra Hall in
A rebuke to Red Velvet.
which is a rebuke to Red Velvet. Was not a bad line.
Some people remember it.
Now more than a decade old.
Yes.
Let's talk about what common themes go from that to Denver to Eugene, Oregon, which is one that I have not actually been to, but which looks quite spectacular in photographs.
Well, in relation to populism, there was an extraordinary idea in that community in that the hall was built for the orchestra. There's an orchestra hall in Chicago called Orchestra Hall, and I'm not sure I know if it was the same impulse, but here, the wealthy patron, and it was a single individual who got the whole thing going, wished to remain invisible and insisted that this be a hall for the orchestra, so that the imagery, both backstage and in the public spaces and where the artists dress, rehearse, and all the rest, should be the same. There wasn't supposed to be anything out front that was fancier than anything behind. And it led to the opportunity to manipulate the land and make a building in which all of the artists have light and air and see out and become a part of the real experience of the city. Whereas traditionally in 19th century halls, the artists were always treated as servants, and they had their own little backstage world, usually without any windows at all or on a narrow alley. And the public got all the romance and the excitement of coming to performance. The imagery, whether it's successful or not, is another matter, but the imagery that built Orchestra Hall was this populist idea, but it was for the orchestra, and it was a room where audience and performer came together, and they came perhaps from different worlds, or it's the same world, since in part it's a community orchestra, and then they share together in the auditorium this common experience. That was, in my experience, very rare, and it has a lot to do with why the place looks the way it does.
More than any stylistic basis in that design.
Yes.
Absolutely. The look of the halls, which is why we showed 3 or 4, one that's coming, is that they all look different.
Right.
It's the sense of trying to bring the people together in a comfortable way in the auditorium, whether it's based on an opera house or a shoebox or whatever the formal restraints are, and to provide that detail in the room that will allow it to feel comfortable for people. Too frequently large rooms these days, especially when you can't have some of Mr. Portman's devices like waterfalls and plants and
Waterfalls
things like that.
tend to get in the way in a concert hall. I
Exactly.
think.
You need to find other kinds of details to use to scale the room to the performers in the audience.
Right.
And that's why those rooms look so different from each other. But stylistically, they appear different, but really they're the same in terms of their approach to the users.
Although in Denver there was this really unusual notion, which had only been attempted once before, and that was in West Germany, that an orchestra, instead of being presented at the end of a room in another place, you take populism one step further.
Put it in
and
the
you
middle.
say, we're all in this together.
Right.
And the orchestra is surrounded by the audience. No one had attempted that except in Europe before.
How successful has that been now that too is nearly 10 years old? That opened in about 78, right?
It depends upon who you speak to.
Okay.
And for what purpose the hall is used.
It's a very startling room for some people because
Right.
during the course of a concert to look directly at the conductor instead of his back or her back is startling. And some people just never recover from that.
But it's interesting, and one should be prepared for this in architecture. It was never conceived of, and one could say it's a fault, but that was the response to the program and the client at the time. The clients all changed. It was never conceived of as anything other than a concert hall. It was supposed to be a hall for the performance of music, be it chamber music, quartets, what have you,
Right.
but it was orchestral music. Its greatest success every spring is its use as an opera house. Because Nat Merrill from the Metropolitan here went out and discovered the place and said, what a sensational room to produce opera and use television. So he has recorded, because you get every conceivable camera
How do you do
angle.
sets, though?
You don't. You do singing. Well, you do props.
I mean, Franco Zeffirelli does not design
No,
any
no.
production.
Wrong room.
And the other thing you don't do is have a solo, because the solo is very hard. But he's very crafty. He is staging a repertoire which all relates to basic duos and trios and things that require movement. But it's so amazing to go there and see the room used in a way that you could never have conceived. And because it's understood by the man who's using it, it looks wonderful. On the other hand, I have also seen the room used in ways that just make it and everything that happens in it dreadful. Theaters in that sense are not unlike houses.
Right.
You can tell if somebody likes their house. It has nothing to do with whether it's messy or not. It's whether you feel that they inhabit it happily, or whether they dislike it, or
Right.
whether they're oblivious to it. They don't even see it. You can
And
sense that.
also like a house, I mean, something that was designed for one client and is later taken over by somebody else has a sort of like a, I don't know, like a marriage that ends and goes on in another direction. What about Eugene, Oregon, the other?
Well, it's different still in premise, because unlike the two concert halls, it was to be this magic thing called a multipurpose hall. And strangely enough, you remember 20 years ago when the proscenium was this restrictive device that was a terrible stricture that had to be broken, and therefore we had all these multi-form spaces.
Right.
The proscenium format turns out, with appropriate supporting stuff, to be the most flexible environment of all, because almost everything can fit in this format. I mean, here we are. This lecture could go on in a round, of course, but this room has probably been used for more kinds of things than any other shape. So Eugene was intended to be a multipurpose hall, and the interesting part, which is a whole other subtext, is acoustics, because Denver and Minneapolis were conceived for natural sound, And in Eugene, there's this magic, wonderful new electronic world called assisted resonance.
What is assisted resonance?
Well, it's not this stuff. This is amplification. This just makes whatever we're saying louder. What assisted resonance does is to take the sound waves that come out of the performer and bounce them around the room electronically instead of just physically because of the architecture. And it is variable and responsive to what the performance is.
It supplements the natural acoustics, because for certain kinds of events,
Right.
you can't have perfect acoustics with fixed shapes.
So that in effect it changes the shape without changing the shape?
The aural shape
The own
changes.
shape, yeah. How does it actually work? What is actually going on?
Electronically.
I mean, what is happening? I mean, what is where that's making this happen? I mean, are there little computer chips?
Yes, they're tiny little microphones that are all buried around that pick up at various places, and then through the use of computers, there are little speakers spread out through the hall, and you can assist the resonance. I mean, for instance, it started out in England when Festival Hall was built after the war, and they didn't have the money to make the right volume. They lowered the ceiling, and everybody complained about the acoustics, and a smart engineer said, I can fix that, and I'll provide some resonance. And he didn't tell anybody.
So he created.
And everybody said in reviews one day, my God, the orchestra sounds great. And then there was a huge uproar because everybody had been deceived, it was felt. Because the orchestra played the same way. It was the acoustics that sounded better. And so it's very
in effect
troublesome.
raised the ceiling electronically, or created
Yes.
the illusion of a larger ceiling.
And so there's this philosophical debate about is that appropriate?
So you can make this room sound like Carnegie Hall with the proper devices.
Right. I mean, you can't make it sound more intelligent, but you can at least make it sound.
The whole movement toward history that has been so critical of part of architectural discourse in the last few years, how does that jibe with your own desire to break programmatically from the traditional concert hall? It seems to me we have an interesting contrast here between a movement in your work to some extent and in that of many other people toward historical form at the same time that you're very consciously moving away from a traditional program. Is that a fair way to present a problem or a question? And if so...
I think that there is a desire to both have traditional forms
Right.
and the development of things to suit some of the things that are now being produced, like dance,
Right.
where dance wants to have its own performance space. And therefore, the shapes of those rooms and the stages are made and really aren't based on specific traditions, unless you want to call a studio a tradition.
Right.
Most communities, unlike Denver and Minneapolis, can't afford, at least initially, to build a single-purpose room.
Right.
And therefore, they can't use a traditional model like the Musikvereinssaal or Concertgebouw, a very specific form, and just repeat it.
Right.
And therefore, a certain amount of invention is needed one way or another to make the multi-purpose auditorium. So in fact, the breaking of tradition, if that's what
Right.
we're going to call it, really comes from what the community wants to do. Now, certain communities may start with a multi-purpose room, and after they have it for 10 years, they may decide to build the other rooms after that.
Right.
But most frequently today, in your terminology, they would be breaking with tradition because they want to have one auditorium do everything.
But Malcolm, your word continuity is also part of it, because there's a great continuity in the imagery of these places. When you say to somebody theater, I'm almost positive that almost everybody in this room would think of a 19th century room. You wouldn't think, I mean, it's just, if you say house, and you went to the wall and drew what a house is, you would draw a little thing like this with a chimney and windows and doors and curtains and so forth. And the same thing is true of theater, so that there's a sort of the reinterpretation and the reinvention, the reinterpretation of the traditional performing arts relationship is as valid as destroying it in the name of something new. We've been through, 15 years ago, every possible effort to destroy the audience-performer relationship, including making no distinction between the two. I mean, we all went to all those happenings and all that environmental stuff where we were all supposed to get up and do it as well. And when you finally get into that, you're into disco. I mean, you've migrated off into some other form completely. So that I think the exploration that performing arts are going through is absolutely fascinating, because it's what we were trying to suggest. It does meld the visual and and performance all at the same time. But increasingly, while that's going on, being a pluralistic place and time, there's increasing concentration on the basic structure of these forms. And the audiences and artists require that basic structure. I mean, Robert Wilson is not performing in the round.
Right.
And the rooms, it's also interesting to see that America's got, at the very moment the theater and the orchestra is in the process of disappearing, I mean, in the sense of a creative new theater, and we have great revivals here and we import wonderful things, but you couldn't claim that New York is the center of creative force in the theater at this point. At the very moment that's true, all over the country people are building performing arts centers. I mean, we got two questionnaires this morning about doing studies to see if, I won't even mention where, because it seemed to be so preposterous, could possibly have the market to produce a performing arts center. At the very moment when there isn't any, all the buildings go up wishing that they could somehow generate this thing called theater.
It's almost
that's not new. I mean, that was done at Lincoln Center
True.
30 years ago, too.
Astonishing.
maybe it's not unlike the 20s when all the movie palaces were built.
Yes.
That's right.
Where-
Just
where-
in time
Very
for the end,
moment.
just in time for the end of the movies.
That's time-based.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. No, I think it is true. What about if we can move to the visual arts for a minute? Museums. You began with Cooper-Hewitt, and then did Richmond, and then Los Angeles. Didn't forget any, did I? Those are the major
No,
ones.
there are a few.
It's okay.
Those are the big ones. Okay.
Those are the big ones.
Is there a similar programmatic shift that you've attempted to express in your work there, or not?
I'm not sure I'd say it's programmatic, but
Okay.
I view the problem as the same. There's a question about how comfortable you feel when you finally end up in the room where you're supposed to be.
Right.
When you're watching a performance, there's a sense of being in the right relationship to where the action is. The same thing's true when you go to a museum and it's time to look at the art. So the designing spaces to have sculpture, paintings, whatever, is a similar situation. One must deal with those objects as specifically as one deals with the theater. And it's more than the tradition of 20 years ago, where if you just had 4 flat walls and a flat floor and a ceiling, you could go home, especially if they were all white. So that tradition is being broken, but I think that there are certain thoughts about what it is that makes a comfortable experience for the viewer and for the object itself to be properly presented.
Museums are really very strange, because it was pointed out to me that architecture doesn't survive. I mean, buildings really don't survive. Basically, most of the good ones disappear. It's objects that survive. That your grandmother's inkwell will be handed down through generations, but your grandmother's house will disappear instantly. And so museums are this increasing sort of storage of artifacts on the one hand, and there are new ones being created through the gallery system for that purpose. And on the other hand, there are people pounding on the doors and the walls and trying very earnestly to destroy the whole idea of a museum through environmental art and other things, and to have people forget all about that tradition and to see afresh, directly experienced through the landscape, if one is Robert Smithson or whatever.
Right.
A completely different kind of experience. And so, like the performing arts, it's all going like this. I mean, it's one of the peculiarities of living in a borrowed wealth society. You know, we're rich on borrowed terms. And the fact that we could support these completely conflicting directions rather than have a centrist notion of what the visual or performing arts are is both stimulating and hell on architecture, because architecture is so slow. Takes so long to make a decent building. And in the meantime, the popular taste or even the institutional taste may have shifted.
I suppose one thing I've always liked about your architecture is that it doesn't ever attempt to express neat and pat truths. I mean, there is no, there are bits and pieces of history in a lot of your work without any suggestion that we can all pretend it's 1910 and be Charles McKim or Stanford White.
No, alas.
And
hopeless.
It is hopeless.
Hopeless. Nostalgia is the sticky stuff. It's very sweet, but it's very sticky, and you have to be very careful about it.
I guess this is what I mean. I mean, your work has always managed to deal in nostalgia without becoming sentimental, which is about the finest line one can walk, I would think, and most of the time it walks it quite
well. Malcolm's
rigorously.
got the right word about continuity. I mean, earlier I think we tried harder, to make confrontations between new and old. But we liked the old. I mean, we worked very hard to polish up some fairly second-rate buildings to make them look good, and then we'd smack into them something that we thought at that point was contemporary.
Chartreuse ductwork or whatever, right.
Which now, of course, is, just rather... But that confrontation was a deliberate one, and it's quite different than I think what we're now attempting to do. I think that premise would be unacceptable publicly. I think it's not appropriate to the time, which raises the other issue about is architecture timeless.
And history isn't always sweet. The part of history that we've grown to see proliferate is the sweet part.
Well, we also sanitize it over time as well.
But history can be quite nasty and hard. So it depends upon which parts of history you're looking for, the strong and the muscular part or the little soft and easy parts. And I think that we enjoy trying to figure out what history is about when we deal with our older buildings. We sort of approach those differently. There are different intentions about those.
Intellectually, I agree completely with you, Malcolm, but let me ask you how this connects with your whole talk a moment ago about comfort in both performing spaces and museum, visual arts spaces. If we are going to intellectually choose to express the sort of difficulty of history, the difficult confrontations, the lack of sugary sweetness, and yet we're also seeking a degree of emotional and visual comfort. How do we make those two things come out right?
Well, when you go to the theater, you'd like to make sure everyone in the audience is awake. There's a measure of that here this evening. But you want everyone to sit on the edge of their seat, and too frequently, if you pick the fullest plush red seat and let them squish back in it, and it's total, you've lost the point of going to the theater. So I think that there is sort of a cutting through of what counts and what doesn't, and trying to exclude all the sweetness that has been passed along to you as sort of the essence of what theater should be about, and to make them of what they should be about. A roundabout answer.
It's a balance, I guess, and sometimes you don't get the balance right. But the odd thing about architecture is it isn't fixed. I mean, the perception of a building changes. The building doesn't change. Well, they do. They get old and fall apart. But in this society, I think the perception of the building changes faster than the building itself, because we're in such orbits ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's very much
culturally.
true. Sure. I mean, it was not that many years ago that the orange and chartreuse exposed ductwork were your virtual trademark.
They're having a revival. The 50s are back.
So is the 60s, and even the early 70s can't be far away. That's right. But you would, does that mean you're about to do them again today?
We're hoping someone will ask us to restore one of our own buildings instead of one of Philip Johnson's.
Yes. Having done both.
Philip Johnson, however, has never restored one of yours.
That's true.
That's true. That's true. It's true.
But
only a matter of time.
Exactly. I guess in a sense, what the concept of history that we've been talking about is expressed, if we can go beyond art and cultural spaces, in a project like the townhouse you did on 11th Street, the house that replaced the federal house that was bombed in that terrible bombing of 1970, in which you consciously chose not to recreate that federal facade, but to do something that in itself expressed a certain degree of discordance and discontinuity.
Yes, it's true, and it offended both sides of the line,
Right.
so to speak. The preservationists were outraged because, having reproduced the cornice and the stoop, it was so obvious that you could have done the rest.
Sure.
And the modernists were really offended that something could be such a pastiche,
Right.
and said it was a failure in all counts. Even though if you went up the stairs and went inside, you found out that there was a relationship between inside and outside, which is a modernist credo, that the outside and the inside must be directly expressed. So that lost all the way around. And it is an interesting. We had never intended it to be a monument, and in the even though there had been this extraordinary history. I mean, the fact that kids blew themselves up in the basement with dynamite, making bombs to overthrow the government of the United States, is unusual. even
Even in those days,
Even in
it
the
did not
village.
happen in every house. That's right.
So it was felt appropriately that something contemporary should happen as an architectural expression, but it was not intended as a monument to the Weathermen. I can remember it was a couple of years that the lot stood empty, and every spring at the anniversary
Right.
of the accident, little strange bouquets would appear at the wall. And I found it very strange. It was all very sad to me somehow. And then the wound in that street was very, very sad. But anyway, the idea of a monument was never intended. And Bill Conklin, who was on the Landmarks Commission at that point and a fine architect, wrote in support of the thing, one of the few, and because it was just barely passed by one vote, wrote this extraordinary, very poetic little statement about how important it was that this site be remembered and that this was a fitting memorial and so forth and so forth. And he interpreted into it something that was never intended. But I think that's perfectly fair. That happens all the time. You're constantly told about things that you did in buildings and in work that you never imagined you did. But if it seems reasonable, maybe it's so.
Well, I think any serious work of art is in fact open to various and complicated and changing interpretations.
And this one ends up as a showcase for bears.
Oh, right. Exactly. Let me actually pause and remind all of you that now is a good moment to jot down profound and witty and clever questions and other questions as well on your index cards and send them over to ushers who will walk around in just a moment. Would you do it that way again? I mean, in one sense, it seems very prescient in that the balance between the physical continuity of the street as expressed in the traditional stoop and the continuity of the top floor and cornice, and yet the rather modernist midsection seems to prefigure a lot of the things that have happened in more recent years. In another sense, the movement toward literal history has become so much more vehement in the last few years. One wonders if the pressure to make a more literal building would have been all the greater. It's really a double question. I ask not only about your own thoughts as architects, but your view of the whole process as students of New York politics and landmarks, too.
Well, I have to answer in a different way. I mean, answer about a different
Sure.
project that we tried, and I think this is fair, Malcolm, when we were doing Eugene, and we worked, this is a concert hall, the one with the slurpy curves in it.
Right.
We really had very much in our minds Carnegie Hall, and that accounts for the double curves. Mm-hmm. We also stole some stuff from Sullivan and the orchestra, and threw in a few other things.
At the auditorium?
But, yeah.
Right.
Because the that big orchestra is divided up with this device of breaking the seating levels so that you get shifts and you don't have this huge plane of heads. It's really a very sophisticated room. Anyway, I think we thought we're not going to reproduce Carnegie Hall, but I was astonished by how difficult it is to get even close in a public space to the proportions and dimensions of earlier rooms.
Right.
And in the case of theaters, it's impossible because all of the dimensions have changed. Our rear ends are bigger than they used to be. On an average,
Even though we're all supposed to eat less and run miles a day and all that.
when Lincoln Center was put together, they went around and measured Americans again, which they hadn't had a chance to do since before the war. And all the seats in Lincoln Center, which established the standards for seating in theaters, hence, from then on, are 2 inches wider than previous. We actually seem to have bigger bottoms than we used to. And the
I
code
wish someone would
dimensions,
tell that to the airlines, actually.
the code dimensions from front to back are all greater, and on and on and on and on and on and on. You can't go home again. You can't go home again physically, and if the physical dimensions change, you certainly can't go home again metaphorically or symbolically. It is not possible. And as you watch these buildings being made on a drawing board, and the drawings may look exactly the same as 100 years ago, but which was the reason for that slide of the quarry, when you actually put the rocks together and they're only this thick, it's impossible. The 20s was obsessed with the past and made all kinds of wonderful buildings from renderings which were done by watercolor and pencil line, and they're all thin. You can always tell a 20s building, even a palazzo, whatever, because it's about that thick. And we've achieved the same kind of ability, only it's that thick and the pieces are all that big.
And they're like paper.
Yeah, they are.
Paul, let me try that differently. I think that if someone came to us, if I understand your question correctly, and said, would we replicate some version of what might have been there before and make it beautiful, I think today we might think about maybe not doing that. Because there are so many other people who have an interest in doing that.
Right.
And I don't think our interests are in that area today. If that had happened when the house happened, we might have thought about it differently then, and maybe we would have entertained the idea. But there's so many other things for us to do that are interesting, that don't relate to recreating history, that I have a sense, would probably say no.
Well, I suspect you're probably right, knowing you as I do, but it's interesting because your own involvement with history as architects precedes that of many other firms, and yet it has never descended into literalism at all, or ascended if you're depending on who you're talking to.
That's what's so interesting about Peter Brook's place, and we cannot claim.
I thought you did the Majestic Theater, which we didn't talk about.
We can't claim credit for the imagery. It's Peter Brook's imagery, but I find it absolutely fascinating that you would determine that a public space was better suited to performance if it was a ruin. And that the actual layers of decay that are in that room, which we had to work like crazy to preserve, are an important environmental statement to the performance because it makes you think about time. Right. And there he is staging this epic, and he couldn't stage the epic in a brand new fancy theater. In LA, they had to create the image by scenery of a ruin, but in Brooklyn, it's a real genuine ruin. And although transformed physically in relation to the stage and so forth. But the interesting intellectual problem of saying that a building that's been destroyed by time is a design statement, is an appropriate place, an architectural expression and so forth, where the hand of the designer is absent to all intents and purposes. Most people who go there think the building was just sort of discovered and open. Is yet another turn of the wheel about the uses of history.
Will the Majestic Theater be workable for other things when Mahabharata ends?
It's going to be, he's going to stage at least 2 more productions there that I know about, and as long as Peter and Bam are interested and so forth, they'll continue. However, it's also funded by the city as a community theater on the basis that it once was. It was built for that purpose, and it would return to that use. And it'll be interesting to see what that means. What is a community theater for? What would the community use it as? But yes, we'll get to see it used that way. I think it'll be very hard for, not only the capacity is less because it's not only 900, but I think it'd be very hard for amateurs to use the room with the same panache. I think they tend to need all the contemporary, what do I want to say, bourgeois middle class trappings. But we'll see.
If we can get away from your work for a moment, what are some of the best older concert halls and theaters that you admire?
The Musikvereinssaal. It's a great room. It's a big rectangular room that seats about 1,800 people, and it has none of the devices that every acoustician now wants to have, in that the orchestra sits at the bottom of a room that's 50 feet tall, and there's nothing over the musicians' heads to reflect the sound, but it sounds wonderful. And it just goes to prove that acoustics are still an imperfect science. It has a lot to do with good architecture.
Right.
Carnegie Hall is a wonderful hall. And then there are some of those atmospheric movie houses where the sense of the illusionistic was supreme that are also a delight to go to.
Well, then there's only one room, and that's Radio City.
Right.
After all, that's the apocryphal one of those.
One other question I was about to ask a moment ago, when you talked about stone, Hugh, and about our technological ability today to do very, very thin, very large pieces of stone, and to use stone almost as a kind of wallpaper veneer. Do you feel comfortable with the increasing tendency to use stone as if it were metal almost? Say in buildings like the IBM building at 57th Street, the Ed Barnes building, in which granite is highly polished, very thin veneer, and by the time you get about 2 blocks away, you would assume that that was in fact a metal building. In one sense, that's an appropriate expression of the contemporary technology of use of stone. In another sense, the stone has lost its stoneness.
I know Malcolm finds it offensive because he kills himself trying to find the biggest rocks available on his continent to make buildings out of, and they are wonderful. Although, even then you can't go home again, because the rustication never quite looks like the building was made in 1910. But you would think that it was possible. I mean, technology's been with us a long time in the sense of new ways to do things. And it's always been possible to take it and use it and make perfectly decent architecture out of it. There's nothing inherently wrong, it seems to me, with slicing up stone. What one finds so horrible is the illusion that one tries to make it into something it isn't.
Right.
Now, that's my modernist upbringing, but I think it feels wrong. There's something odd about a building that is purporting directly to be a kind of imagery that it isn't, when you know that it's all actually aluminum, and as you say, the stone is wallpaper. Right. But I see nothing wrong with the idea of slicing up stone and making buildings out of it. Your particular example is a tough one because the polished granite really looks like bad metal.
Right.
But there are other buildings around town, some blue ones, and so forth, where the stone still registers as stone in a very decorative way, and it's kind of foolish and endearing. But you know that it's stone.
You know that it's stone, right?
There's no. It's that middle gray ground, like someone singing off key.
But you kind of did it both ways in Richmond, didn't you? With the relatively thin limestone, and then the very rough-hewn limestone courses as well.
Well, the prevalence of stone today is because there's a lot of money to spend on certain kinds of buildings.
Right.
So what you see is essentially the upgrading by a developer of the skin of a building, upgrading only in the expense of the material. So it goes from glass to metal to stone, but it's still the same thickness. And I think that they believe that because it shines or it's red, orange, or green, it's better than if it were aluminum color. But the question is, does the product look like it's masonry? Does it feel any more stable? Does it convey what we have traditionally thought stone was about? Occasionally we explore that in some of our buildings because they're lumpy and they sit there instead of acting like glass and trying to take off at the same time.
On the other hand, if technology permits stone to be a different material than it once was, to be wallpaper, then does expressing stoneness mean the same thing it used to anyway?
No, but its application will be totally different. I think the problem is that it will take a long time to figure that out. the tradition of making big masonry buildings that sit firmly on the ground is 1 centuries old.
Right.
But making thin, skinny, reflective stone buildings is something new. And in fact, if you walk up and down 3rd Avenue, you can see a couple of those buildings are falling apart already, and they haven't been up for 10 years.
Right.
So there's even a question about the technology that's being employed that has glued the stones to the building.
How about stone elevators?
It's big stuff now, isn't it?
Well, it's
That's
like,
my favorite.
It's like the Madonna Inn,
Right,
where they make a stone bed. It's like the Flintstones.
There's some good questions. Let's turn to a few of those now. Please address the design changes for the Bryant Park Library project, which is a project of yours we've not yet talked about, in terms of preservation, historic imitation, and site planning.
Preservation.
Just say what you wish about Bryant Park. It's really the question.
Oh, gosh.
Few wishes that were built already.
It's only been 10 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a long, long story, and so it's hard to comment not knowing which part of the story the question relates to. But there's a new proposal going to be discussed again in public some more about another idea to do the same thing, which is populism, which is the idea that if people of all sorts, not just the particular segment of society that's there now, but if everybody came to Bryant Park, it would be better off. And so how do you do that? We don't seem to have many devices in the society. I mean, you wouldn't put a seat of government there, or there already is a library, just you can't enter it from that side. That might be the best solution of all.
Put a door to
which
the
is just to put a great big staircase on the west side of the library and be done with it and let people go in there. So for whatever reason, and I think it's a good one, a restaurant has been chosen as the way to populate the park. And there was an earlier scheme with a different restaurateur and a different state of mind and a different public consciousness and a different consensus. Same library, but a lot of other differences. And there was the notion that it should be a grand cafe and that it would be, in effect, the completion of the original design for the library, sort of. I mean, you couldn't complete that building, but the building is incomplete in the terms in which it was originally conceived. All of that was before the building was cleaned, before it began its restoration process, and before a lot of other things. Now there's another scheme to do the same thing in a different way, to have smaller, only 1 story tall, separate pavilions, which would be a part of the West Terrace and a part of Bryant and the sculpture that is the monument to Bryant, and to allow really the same idea, but in completely different terms. It's impossible to compare the two and make judgments because they're entirely different, it's apples and pears. And the hope is that instead of a monumental piece of architecture, one could just make a modest park structure that had vines on it and was just a thing that went away, as the structures do, I think, in parks in Paris. And it's appropriate because the imagery for the Bryant Park is a Parisian park, not an English park, not any other culture. It's a Parisian park. And so those kinds of structures seem like a good idea. But it's a long way from construction, even though ground will be broken in January for the stacks. And these buildings must sit on top of the stacks, so stay tuned.
Clearly, not everyone is welcome in your buildings. Criminals, psychotics, and violent people. Will you comment on civility as a characteristic of your work?
I think we should reorganize the slides, right?
Civility.
Yes.
I understand the question except the word civility.
Me too. I don't. Maybe a little better explanation of that word would help.
Well, I'm not the questioner in this case.
I know. Well,
so
maybe the
there's not too much
questioner
I can do.
To be civil, it means good behavior, or it means civil in the sense of citizen, and I'm not sure.
Maybe the questioner is actually just interested in pursuing the whole idea of
Including everybody.
including everybody and populism and
It's tough.
middle-class comfort and bourgeois
It's tough.
ideals and how one expresses them, or if one is expressing them, what does all that mean?
I probably overstated the case. I've been known to do that. The point is that there are quite clearly many buildings today that are built that don't welcome anyone. It's not their goal, but too frequently the buildings that are held up to be discussed are usually discussed in terms of what do they look like on the outside and are they beautiful?
Right.
Infrequently are they discussed in terms of are they pleasant things to be in, and are they going to function for another 20 years in a reasonable way? Not necessarily perfectly, and do they make you feel reasonably good when you're in them? I don't think our buildings are the same things to all people. I don't think we welcome criminals in all of our buildings, although I'm sure
We
have used some. It would be hard to exclude everyone. So I think that the notion that we make welcoming buildings may sound a little sort of middle American, because quite clearly that's not what we set out to do. We're not trying to be the McDonald's of architecture.
Well, that's kind of what I got at earlier on with my Portman question
And
as well.
I think that quite clearly we don't do that. But I think that there is something about our architecture, because it is a public architecture. We make many buildings where the public is forced to use it all the time, and therefore we're forced to think about how we allow them to come in there and have a reasonable time.
But these are very troubling questions, and I'm not sure architecture can answer them. In fact, I think architecture's asked a lot to answer questions which it can't. It can't answer religious questions, really, and it can't answer some of these social problems. We are trying to make a library in an Eastern Seaboard community, an extension to a library, and I was told today something that I just found so depressing, that it's an addition to an existing building, and Cass Gilbert was the architect, and he sure knew what he was doing.
We know what city that is.
And he made a building which was in the image of an English country gentleman's home, and it was perfectly appropriate in this community at that time that would be a public library. Now, you would sneer at it today, unless you happen to come from that background, and say that it was absolutely wrong, because it doesn't express a public building. It's really the upper percentage of the culture that built it. No. But it is beloved by the preservationists and sits in a prominent location and so forth, and we're adding on to it. And all the new circulation is in a new part of the building, and that's fine. And there's a children's library on the second floor, and that's fine. Today was the discussion, which mercifully I was spared, that when the children come up in the elevator unsupervised and throw things off the mezzanine, which we've created, into the old public space, people will be unhappy, and when the children and so forth. And so the result is that we have to construct, it was proposed, Lexan screens from floor to ceiling, all the way around from the elevator into the children's library. And it is such a depressing comment on the state of librarians' mentality that it could be thought that that was the solution to a problem. It isn't. I mean, the next step is to discover that the children are vandalizing the elevators, these hooligans that have come to the public library. And so you would have to construct within the elevator some kind of television monitored thing with bells and electronics so that they couldn't torch the elevator, and then on and on and on and on. And it is insane.
It all goes to show there's nothing more dangerous than giving children access to books. They should know better. I mean, really.
Clearly.
Let me move on to this double question. Did your firm feel somewhat cheated in the press? by having your LA County Museum open so closely with Isuzaki's Contemporary Art Museum, both museums having opened in the fall of 1986. And also, can you give us a sneak preview hint of what to expect in the Rainbow Room, which you're renovating? Two very different questions, but if you can take them both.
You were just in Los Angeles.
The answer to the first question is yes and no.
A sound answer, indeed.
It would be difficult to imagine that any major American city could open two museums within a year of each other and not imagine that comparisons would be made.
Sure.
One would have thought that maybe some of the comparisons would be more astute. but that's the nature of reporting. But by and large, I think it's good. I think it's helpful to draw comparisons, and if one understands what's being compared, it seems to be fine. The Rainbow Room will be a great surprise, I think, to many people, because there's a lot more at the top of those buildings than just one room. And there's been a considerable amount of effort there to convey a sense of what the place was like, but most of it is new.
Right.
And Hugh, you may wish to add a few things about that.
Yeah, that is primarily your project, Hugh, right?
Yes, I'll be the one. You can come and talk to me later. But a comment on LA, it's certainly fair to compare buildings. Why not all the time? The thing that I guess we found disorienting was that they seem to be being compared on the same terms, even though the sites and the traditions and the purposes and the legacy and the future of both institutions is so drastically different. But I don't remember reading any consideration of that much. The Rainbow Room is interesting because it is this, it's the foot on the dock and the foot on the boat. And if they part, you're in trouble. There's no question about what to do with the Rainbow Room. You do everything possible to restore it in every sense you know how, mythically and every other way. But to make it comfortable for contemporary audiences, you've got to be able to see, which you couldn't in the old Rainbow Room. It can't look quite so tatty, and all the stuff has to work that it had got to be decayed. So when you restore a room in a strange way, you try and turn the clock back. All the rest of the stuff can't look like it was done in 1934, which was when the Rainbow Room was built. On the other hand, if it looks like 1987 and beyond,
Nobody's going to want to go there.
will it fit in the RCA building? Because the RCA building is such a powerful presence, not only for the city, since it's lit up brighter than day, but when you're in it, because of the configuration of the building, you keep seeing the building. You see those funny parapets and so forth. You cannot be in that building and not be aware of where you are. Yeah. So talk about context. It is so overwhelmingly powerful. And so on the one hand, to produce something contemporary, and on the other hand, to acknowledge the context is just excruciatingly difficult. And until it's all together, I haven't the faintest idea if we've succeeded.
Okay. Next year we'll pick up where we left off on that one. However, happily there is no Isozaki restaurant next door.
No. Funny idea.
What architectural interpretation would you give to Times Square as a performing space in the light of its new development and zoning regulations?
Oh gosh, you really would like to see somebody do it right. I mean, you really would like to see somebody take this, talk about populism. I mean, if that isn't New York's room for everybody, where do we go to celebrate things? Well, Central Park, I guess, now on New Year's Eve because of the fireworks.
Yeah, actually, we really don't go to Times Square anymore in the way people used to.
Well, I was there last New Year's Eve, and I was astonished. I will admit, however, it was the B&T crowd as much as it was the locals. People increasingly use New York as an amusement park. And the natives go elsewhere. But the idea of, the imagery of what New York is and why we put up with the inconvenience and the squalor of the place has so much to do with the nature of populism and the idea that everyone is welcome. And it gets you in all kinds of trouble. The streets are a mess, but the glory of the city is the streets. And from my point of view, Times Square is a magical part of New York. And a building could express that, I think. The difficult part is that the buildings that are being generated there are being generated basically as office buildings for the corporate sector. And that's not known for its frivolous, frolicsome nature.
And they'd also have to convey or have, in fact, cheap things to do, cheap theaters. When the movies were only $2 to go to, now that they're going to $7,
yeah.
And cheap food, and therefore you get a lot of people using it. And I think you'd have to build those kinds of things in as sort of street theater in order to have some continuity in the sense of the place.
I see none of that actually happening.
Nope. Well, it's potentially possible because of what city planning is reluctantly inching towards, but it may be too late. I mean, the imagery for a well-known project on 42nd Street, which is quite large,
Right.
As promoted by, not what happened in public discussion, but as originally promoted in the glossy brochures, said that this would be a second Rockefeller Center. And the enclave aspect of Rockefeller Center is absolutely magnificent on its own terms, but to do that to a piece of the intersection of Broadway and 42nd Street seems quite strange. But it's not hopeless, not hopeless. The buildings aren't built yet.
Although they do kind of glump toward.
Well, the holes are getting
reality.
bigger every day.
Right, exactly.
Have you been over there recently?
Oh,
There's
yeah.
there's nothing there but holes.
I know, it's an extraordinary moment visually right now.
Yes.
That,
With a few signs.
right.
And it's the only place in the city that signage is even acceptable. I remember you writing about the sign that people could see from Central Park. And
Yes,
it was
right.
offensive to them.
Right.
It's a moment.
The majority of your work has been low-rise, special-use buildings. Do you have a desire to do a high-rise building? And another similar question asks, other than visual and performing arts spaces, what projects would you like to build? You've done very few houses, right? And
Not
no
recent.
religious buildings.
We did a church.
Did you do a church?
Sure.
Ah.
In downtown Old St. Luke's in the fields.
Oh, right, of course.
And we haven't done a house, Paul, for some time, although recently I think each of us is going through the house mill.
There are a few houses being built. Yes, we'd like to try a tall building. We're working up to that. And I think there are certain projects that I'm not sure we really want to do, but the thought is there that you might like to. The notion that you could do a medical building that wasn't medicinal
Right.
and didn't smell bad when you walked in it and make your hands start to sweat immediately. There's certain things that you wish you could bring your skill to, but I'm not sure anyone's going to ask us to do a hospital right away.
Well, they're not even necessarily architectural problems, except that's not fair because some.
Well, they're not solely architectural problems, but they're not architectural problems
Exactly.
either.
In,
It is-
no, I mean, we've always, it's interesting to hear that when you listen to the question, you realize that we're talking about populism. These are all elitist buildings, somebody is saying to themselves. We don't think of them that way, though. I mean, the museum has certainly become the zoo and circus of a bunch of contemporary culture. And in that sense, I suppose. But, you know, we've always thought that architecture was a great big word, and it could do anything, absolutely anything. It's what's so amazing to see as you look backwards that there were moments in time when it wasn't missile silos and all that stuff that was the cutting edge of technology. It really was architecture itself. It certainly was in the 50s. It certainly was when they put that big chain around the dome in Florence. I mean, there have been moments, not true now. I mean, the technology of slicing up marble thin doesn't galvanize public enthusiasm, but there have been moments in time when architecture actually was the cutting edge of what society was up to. And maybe that'll happen again.
It's interesting because architecture right now is not the cutting edge in that sense, and yet is the subject of enormous public discourse and public concern without being at the cutting edge.
It's become very social.
Yeah.
Great to talk about. Still hard to make, though.
Still hard to do.
There are two questions about museums. One of them is prefaced, "I think you are great," with a star and exclamation point. And however, it then asks you to comment on. No, you're quite
Stop there.
That's right off the hook. It asks you to comment on the additions to the Guggenheim and the Whitney.
Oh, unfair.
I have a comment.
Okay.
I think that anyone who thinks that buildings are not made to be added onto is foolish, especially in these days and ages. If one goes to the great cities of the world, some of the finest buildings we know are either additions themselves or have been added to. The notion that any building is perfect in and of itself and will sit there forever on its own, I find totally ridiculous, especially in a city like this that was founded on change and modification over time. So I think one of the topics that I guess I haven't heard discussed a lot is why more people haven't argued with those people who say those buildings are perfect, leave them alone. And there have been a lot of those. And I think that from my point of view, both of those buildings could be added to, and quite satisfactorily, and there are lots of examples for that.
Well, I think you're right, and a distinction has to be made between those who have questioned the specifics of these additions and those who've questioned the principle of adding anything at all. I mean, that's a fair and important distinction.
But it's, by and large, I think New Yorkers have become frightened of change.
Right.
They're very uneasy about it because the public seems to feel that new buildings are inevitably worse.
That's right.
than
Well,
what
very much
was.
so. I think that the great sort of unspoken impulse behind preservation today is the fear that whatever happens will be worse than whatever is threatened. Sure, that we simply can't do it. Absolutely. Another museum question asks you, why do you think recent art museum design seems less successful than traditional spaces? And can you comment on the d'Orsay, the Beaubourg, the East Wing of the National Gallery, and so forth?
All of the above.
Are you going to...
I don't know, it's funny. It's all relative. It has to do with what the art in question is. I mean, we were criticized, for addition to everything else, by some in Los Angeles because the galleries, I've forgotten, it is as if all the heroes of modern architecture, and I could recite them, had never existed. And the galleries are wrong because they don't acknowledge the great modernist movement and all the efforts that were spent in that regard without thinking about what's being put on display and what the works were created for. So that galleries are funny. You can't discuss them in abstract. It has to do with what the intent of the collection is and whether a museum is a general purpose museum intended to sort of a survey, if you will, or whether it's intended to be on the cutting edge and constantly environmentally address the new. I don't know how you can generalize about galleries. Some work wonderfully. I mean, Norman Rockwell paintings really look great. If you like them at all, they really look great in the funny little house in Stockbridge. If you took the Norman Rockwell paintings out and had them presented,
Or put them in the High Museum.
great big white walls and so forth, they would really not look as rather pleasant and anecdotal and charming.
You don't
as they
think
are.
Richard Meyer should do the new Norman Rockwell
Don't
Museum?
think that's appropriate.
I also think the three examples cited are more than buildings about the exhibition of artwork.
Sure.
That what those architects and those clients were up to was making much larger statements about lots of other things than just, can you see this glass of water well? And I think those buildings were specifically cited because of that.
Right.
And everyone knows that there are certain difficulties in using them as museums.
But they, in each case, did accomplish the larger purpose. I mean, good. Certainly in Atlanta.
That wasn't cited.
Atlanta was not cited, but you may cite it.
I cite it. I mean, certainly there was a much larger purpose.
You know, kind of
in
a
mind.
cultural galvanization.
I mean, they had that ghastly place that was built and so forth, and it was a mistake, and they were determined to do it right the next time. And they call attention to the whole idea of culture, et cetera, et cetera.
Good. The final part of this question asks you if you want to design a plate.
A hot plate.
I think it's legitimate, but I'm not lusting to design plates. It seems to me there are an awful lot of plates in the world, and that
There are an awful lot of buildings too, Hugh.
yeah, but they're not. There may be more good plates than good buildings. Sure, it's fun. I mean, it's fun doing those things, but teapots.
You haven't done a teapot either.
No.
You've never done any household object.
Haven't done a birdhouse. Haven't. No. No.
And you call yourself an architect? Really? You haven't done a plate, you haven't done a
buttons.
teapot,
Yeah.
and you call yourself an architect. Extraordinary.
I tell you.
Do you feel that there's an increasing effort to use the Landmarks Preservation Commission to achieve zoning and planning ends
No
that
question.
may undermine public and political support for its authority?
No, I think it's gaining support and gaining authority by filling in this void that no other institution in the city will do, because we don't really have a planning commission.
Right.
And the Landmarks Commission is being bent out of shape to do these things, but increasingly gets public support. I mean, the public, when it has a zoning issue, rushes to where there's some power and authority, and it finds it in the Landmarks Commission. So the real estate interests are upset, but they really, in this sense, are a minority. The real estate interests didn't create the Landmarks Commission, the public did. Not the profession, either. Architects didn't do it.
It's a related question.
Well, that's not fair, because
is,
architects did do it, but because there were architects who were on it, but and it was some extraordinary people who thunk it up. But it was really a groundswell of public support, not the profession, that made the Landmarks Commission possible.
No, I think very much so. Sure. And Penn Station, which sort of died that other buildings might live at some point.
There you go.
Anyway, a related question is, what should be the role of the Municipal Arts Society and the City Planning Commission in a world where nostalgia is sticky stuff, to quote you, and architecture, unlike inkwells, does not survive?
What should the role be? I think it's one of public education. I think one tries, I mean, if the public really understood what was going on in Times Square, I'd feel more comfortable. I think that the role, certainly the Municipal Arts Society, should not be tastemaker.
Right.
Should not, it's one of the debate about the additions to the two museums at times grew close to taste-making, which from my point of view wasn't what was at issue at all. And certainly MAS has got the opportunity to do extraordinary amount of, I don't mean education in the sense that the public is unenlightened. The public is very enlightened, but it's uninformed. One doesn't know what's really going
Right.
on. And the poor Planning Commission is having trouble, but it has since it was invented. It was a good idea. We should have such a thing.
It should actually be planning, however.
But we don't have one.
On the Municipal Arts Society and taste-making, though, you're right that debate became perilously close to taste-making at times. On the other hand, if we accept Malcolm's premise that it is not wrong in principle to add to those buildings, but the question is only the appropriateness of a specific design, then isn't it inevitable, if one begins with that very same principle and the Municipal Arts Society also accepts it, that its own debate would become somewhat closer to taste-making?
Yes, and it makes it difficult. The MAS got split in two because it couldn't, from my point of view, distinguish between those two
Sure.
factors. And there was this, I don't know why we're discussing this, it's not fair to those who are not part of the organization, but there was this board meeting in which it just broke apart because they couldn't create any consensus. From my point of view, it was because the two things were all tangled up. And again, although it's thumbs up, thumbs down, I like it, I don't like it, is exactly what I think an organization like that shouldn't be doing. Should be trying to make relevant, to reveal, what's the right word, to make clear the issues involved so the public could decide and take informed and intelligent positions that the public could react to.
But on the other hand, it would be nice if there were a way to discuss, are those buildings beautiful enough to be next to these other buildings without disguising that in issues like zoning and landmarks and using those as clubs against the architecture. It would be much more healthy to just come right out and discuss it. And not many people actually do that.
Well, there's the hard part, Paul, that you write about sometimes, about buildings that just fit in. And it's okay to make buildings that just fit in, when in fact the profession is all wired up to make buildings and jump up and down and say, look at me, because those are the ones that get all the attention. And it's a very hard subject. Those buildings, unless they're going to change, unless the institution they house is going to change identity, create a new way in, a whole new approach, a whole new something, not just a new director, but a whole different philosophy about what their programs are, then in addition to that building has got to somehow continue on and provide some continuity, and it is particularly tough in the case of the Whitney, because there was a definite departure without anything to hang it on, in the sense that there's no new entrance. It was just more Whitney, with this huge departure, and it makes the conversation very difficult, because then people do line up and say, I like it, I don't like it, and it's pretty, it isn't pretty. It isn't really the issue.
But I think it would be good if there were a forum to discuss it, because I found a lot of the commentary about it highly offensive. It was as if these architects hadn't considered in great detail what they were doing.
Yeah.
I mean, some of what was written, and you could find it almost everywhere, all over the place, in every magazine you could pick up, gave you the impression that they didn't know what they were about. And I thought that they maybe didn't have the proper forum to explain what they were doing, because frequently they were discussing landmarks and other issues and program and whatever, and were unable to present what it was the architecture was about.
Good. I think we have time for one more. Let's end with this one. It's not a trick. It's just a very straight, nice, wholesome question. What is it like to have a cultural organization as a client compared to a corporation or an individual?
They can be one and the same, or they can be all entirely different. I mean,
Can you say a little more?
There are cultural organizations conceived by an individual, and their presence is still very much a part of how it's all run. Or they can be operated sort of like corporations, in which nobody's in charge and everybody is. And you can't generalize, I think. It really depends. We've certainly
Frequently they're the same, because
Yes.
boards and commissions are frequently made up of 100 lawyers.
Right,
So when you go to a building committee meeting, you're in fact meeting with a law firm.
right.
True.
So there's not much difference really, and occasionally a doctor thrown in.
On the other hand, there's a certain amount of isn't there something different between situations, and some of them are cultural institutions and some of them are not, in which one individual clearly emerges as the client, either because he's been designated by the board to make many decisions himself or herself.
Absolutely.
And situations in which you really are dealing only with a committee and you're forced to achieve a degree of consensus that can often, make the situation into a camel.
More than not, though, everybody's in charge, in the sense that he's in charge of this and she's in charge of that, and you talk to them if you want, and then he does color.
Right.
And architecture relates all of them. And so you don't have what you're taught in school about, you don't have a client, because there isn't somebody for whom you're doing this glorious work. You're doing it with them. And they all are perfectly, the guy who controls the purse strings and says, I don't like blue, is a big force, even though he may not be the director of the museum. Mm-hmm. And the director of the museum may be absolutely impotent in making choices at all.
But when you do have a singular client, that is someone who represents the client, it's a much easier situation.
No question.
But frequently, the difference between a cultural institution and a private one, they're exactly the same. You have lots of people to deal with all the time. And quite clearly, it's much easier to deal with an individual or two. Right. And there's no difference between a private institution or a cultural one.
If you look back at the work that you're proudest of, is there generally a very strong client connected with it or not? Or is there no correlation at all?
I don't think there necessarily is, Paul. I think, the joy of working with an individual is, if you like them, well, first of all, you have to get to like them, I've always thought. Now, there's this wonderful correspondence between Kaufman and Wright.
I'm falling water.
But they clearly respected each other. But the business of working with an individual who is the client is to try and understand them. It's a fascinating process. It isn't just doing what you're told, because you may discover that what they tell you they want is all wrong. They don't realize that they're giving you the solution, and you have to find out from them what they want, and they've given you the wrong solution. That's no less true if you're working with a group of 6 people. It's just as fascinating to figure out what they want And so I'm not sure that, although the theory is that great architecture is made only with a strong individual, two strong individuals, one a great architect and the other a great client, that's a 19th century reality. I don't know why that has to be a contemporary reality. And in my own experience, it hasn't been. That isn't to say there aren't very powerful individuals in these projects, but in my case, it really has been more groups of people rather than and we've certainly gotten some astonishing results out of groups of people. I mean, I was thinking about the logs in Eugene because of those photographs, and there was nobody you could identify in that client who would support this wacky notion of those timbers.
Sometimes it's easier to make a building when you're dealing with an amorphic situation and no one is really responsible for anything. But it takes a much longer period of time to do that.
Yes.
It's much easier and moves much more quickly when you have someone who you can always go to.
Good, great. Good. Malcolm, Hugh, thank you very much for being here. And thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.